Hi, this is Liv Morgan, and you are listening to No One Knows, a deep dive podcast into the mysterious death of Joann Matouk Romain.
Yeah, hi, Liv. This is Steve Haney, attorney. I've been licensed in Michigan and practicing in Arizona for over 20 plus years.
Awesome.
And I came connected to the case through Joann Matouk, probably back in 2020 is when I first became introduced to the case and became familiar with it.
And then I want to give everybody kind of a backstory on just your position. Obviously, you're an attorney now and you practice both in Michigan and Arizona, but kind of how you've worked and the different positions you've had, I will say, which kind of makes you a little bit more familiar with, not in particular these type of cases, but just cases that you've handled and how kind of the chain of command works. So do you want to give us just a rundown of the type of positions that you've had aside from being an attorney?
Yeah, sure. I've began my career as a prosecutor, a county prosecutor, gun and drugs primarily.
Okay.
Back in the early 2000s, and ran a division, the gun and drug unit in Jackson County, and then transitioned from there to the Michigan Attorney General's office, where I headed up a specialized unit that dealt with organized crime. And, through those 15, 20 years of being involved in criminal defense and also as a prosecutor, had a real familiarity with the anatomy of how a prosecution works and the chain that it goes through to get to a point where a prosecutor evaluates facts of a case and then makes a decision whether or not they want to proceed and charge a case. And that's what kind of drew my attention to this case when Joann Matouk came to me and presented some of the information. At that point, I wasn't really familiar with everything, but as I became acquainted with the sisters Kelly and Michelle, I had, and also listened to your podcast, which you did a phenomenal job of presenting everything. I became more interested in it as not just as a prosecutor, but as somebody that's been involved in looking at how cases are prosecuted and investigated over a period of over 20 years.
Like you had said, we kind of jumped on a call together, and you were like, "I've listened to the podcast. Like, what am I missing?" And that was where I think we had only had maybe 10 or 12 episodes out at the time. So we had gotten through a lot of the nitty gritty of everything, but we kind of presented you with everything and you were amazing. And you were like, listen, I know a lot of people. I have worked in many different areas. What can I do? And we were like, this is incredible. Obviously, with that being said at the start, the kids, I would say, are always on like high alert just because they've had people come into cases, right? And specifically with their mom, and they've kind of, I wouldn't say haven't done the things they should do, but there's been a lot of people, a lot of corruption, a lot of things, but there's also been a lot of great people too. So obviously we hop on a call with you, we kind of go through everything. And then you tell us that you work, I'll kind of let you lead, but you work directly with an individual who's now a PI. And I'll let you kind of explain to our listeners what you did, because that was kind of everything you did behind the scenes of everything.
Yeah, I mean, really my initial, concerns were, after I watched the Unsolved Mysteries episode, which I think only, touched on a real superficial level of what really seemed to be problematic of the case. I took this to a very close friend of mine and also somebody that I've worked with for over 20 years, who was my investigator at the Attorney General's office, a private investigator by the name of Al Norris, who is 30 years retired detective sergeant with the Michigan State Police. And Al and I have worked closely together on multiple cases, including murders and organized crime during that period of time. And I wanted him to, make an independent evaluation of what he felt, he thought about the case, because I had some strong feelings about what my observations and my findings were. And when I took this to Al, I, gave him all the information. And fortunately, I had a significant investigative materials through the federal lawsuit that was filed, and also the family had provided me with some very confidential information. And I turned it over to Al. I said, look, you've been my close friend, and we've worked together for 20 years. You tell me what you think about this, and if my feelings are out of line, let me know honestly and objectively. And he looked at it too, and he shared the same feelings that I did. And that's how he and I both came, I think, to be invested in this and wanted to pursue this further on behalf of the family. And really in the interest of justice, because, this is something that is troubling. Anyone who looks at this objectively, I think, would agree that just the facts of this case, any one of many, 30 or 40 different facts of this case, you'd find to be troubling on any level. Not just me looking at it as a defense attorney, but me looking at it as a former prosecutor and attorney general. It bothered me that this was handled the way that it was from the very beginning to the current time that we're still trying to see if somebody will look at this objectively and re-examine, some of the actions that were taken by the police department.
Agreed. And I think that says a lot for you, being a prosecuting attorney at one point and still being an attorney today, that you're looking at the case and you're going, yeah, something's not right here. There's a lot of evidence. And I remember you had asked us to come up with 10 items. You had said, can you guys come up with 10 items? There's no way of explaining them, right? So we get the 10 items to you. You and Al Norris create a great presentation. We get things together. And from there, you guys were able to, Al Norris had some connections to the Michigan State Police.
Yeah, no, I think, Al and I have, through the years of our careers collectively have developed, I think, a reputation of having some credibility on both sides of the table. No knock on lawyers that have been defense attorneys their entire career, but I've been on both sides of the table. So I've charged crimes, I've prosecuted crimes, anywhere from murders to organized crime. Al has as well. And so we kind of had a different prism that we were looking at this than maybe the average person. And full disclosure, I wasn't retained by the family and with respect to being paid to do this. I was doing this as a matter of just looking at this with fascination, really, at how botched this was from the outset. And I think as Al learned of the case and as I presented it to him, we both became a little infatuated with it. And he's busy, I'm busy. I'm practicing in 2 different states. I manage a firm out in Arizona. I handle federal cases all over the country, and it really consumed us, to be quite frank. I listened to your podcast. I listened to every episode over a period of a 6-hour drive up to Traverse City on a holiday weekend, and I just couldn't stop getting away from it. It was really, in doing this 23 years, I don't have too much that consumes me because I'm just busy, right?
Yeah.
And Al and I both were finding ourselves captivated. No better word for it than that, as to just how unbelievable this case really is. And I think if anyone dives into this, listens to your presentation and looks at the chronology of things that happened that night, for anyone to believe that this woman walked into that water and committed suicide would have to be out of their mind. And I think that's what really drew us into this and brought us to the point where he and I both collectively use all our resources, all our relationships that we've developed over decades to take this to the highest level of the Michigan State Police. Look, we didn't go to some guys that are working the desk in a particular division or office. We took this to the very highest command at the MSP, Michigan State Police, and presented a very comprehensive 25-page document of every single thing that didn't make sense, and asked them to revisit this and reopen an investigation into what quite clearly was a murder. Yeah. And I say that very objectively. I don't say that with any motive or any particular agenda. Like I said, I believe in the family, and I have become close to the family. However, I'm paid to do my job as a lawyer, to be objective and look at things rationally and look at all sides to make sure there's, maybe not some avenue that we could be looking at this in the wrong way.
Mm-hmm.
And Al and I both collectively had an overwhelmingly, we were on the same page that this just didn't make sense to us.
Yeah. And I think that's important for people to note, because there's a lot of, naysayers out there that say, oh, they hired this person and they paid them to say that. And it's obviously, for you being very credible in the work that you do in the line of work, it's very important for people to understand that this is something you willingly took on just based off of all of the evidence, that was presented to you. And I think it's important. I kind of want to touch on the meeting that you guys had. So the meeting, we obviously had to be very quiet about certain things. The meeting that you had with MSP, let's kind of touch on that. How did the meeting go? How do you, feel that the evidence you really presented to them, how that entire meeting transpired, and then kind of the outcome of that meeting?
Yeah, I mean, the meeting was largely, as I stated, it was dependent upon the relationships that Al had developed over 30 years at the Michigan State Police. Look, this guy was a decorated decorated detective sergeant. He was somebody that, captained the dive team in the Detroit River. I mean, he was a detective sergeant. I ran the organized crime unit at the Attorney General's office, and we worked together on many cases that were very sensitive, and we had a lot of success in what we did. So we had relationships, obviously, at the highest level of law enforcement. And I did actually, when I was at the county prosecutor's office too in Jackson, I was the head of the drug forfeiture unit and worked very closely with the top level of the Michigan State Police. So, we knew that when we presented this to people that we presented it to at the highest level of the Michigan State Police, that it would get attention that maybe the family wasn't able to reach as they were trying to get attention. And I thought the meeting was productive. We presented a PowerPoint presentation that was exhaustive, for lack of no other word. That included everything: witness reports, interviews, police reports, crime scene photographs, autopsies, just about everything investigative that's occurred in this case over the last 14 years. And they looked at it for about a period of a month and a half. At the end of the day, they came back to us and felt that procedurally they weren't able to advance this any further without prosecutorial involvement, which for me makes some sense on a certain level, because it's important to understand that police officers don't charge crimes, prosecutors do. So at the end of the day, you need a prosecutorial authority to take this case and then assign it to law enforcement to have them investigate it and present it for review of charges. So what that leaves you with really is jurisdictional issues with this case being under the jurisdiction of the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office, which obviously would be a conflict because the primary objective suspect in this case would be Tim Matouk. And he works at the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office. So how would they be able to ethically or objectively prosecute a case where they have their employed investigator working at that office? So that's not the correct authority to look at this case. So you'd have to go to the Attorney General's office, which we're in the process of examining and trying to present to them as well, or you get the federal level. So it presents a lot of challenges procedurally to find a way to get a case 14 years old, to present it to law enforcement, which are asking law enforcement to investigate law enforcement, which, is always a difficult ask and challenge with any thing such as this.
Well, and I think what it comes down to, too, is there's a web of people, right? So different departments, different people who are investigating, or at the time I'm using air quotes, investigated. And we kind of come back to this. Okay, we've spoken with the Wayne County prosecutor. They're unwilling to look into anything. They said it's not their job to investigate a crime. It's only their job to bring charges. Okay, so then we break it back down. We go to Grosse Pointe Woods, Grosse Pointe Farms. Well, if that's where the corruption starts, then what do? Right? You've exhausted all avenues. You've done all of that. And this isn't the first time that this case has come across MSP's desk. There was a time just a few years, obviously, after Joann had gone missing, that Michelle and Scott Lewis also met with individuals, not as high up, obviously, that you guys did, but they were shut down immediately as well. I think it was different, obviously, the meetings, because it was different individuals, but it was concerning, obviously. And then I wasn't totally shocked when you came back and said, hey, they're not going to take the case. But at the same time, I kind of was shocked, if that makes sense. I'm not as familiar. Obviously, I'm not an attorney. I don't have the years of experience. But with all the things that you guys presented, I felt like was a solid, like it was wrapped up very nice with a bow. So I come back to this like, okay, so if MSP isn't going to take it, and we went to the top, and their reasoning is like, hey, we don't have anybody to investigate it because Wayne County, yada, yada. What's the next step of everything?
I think the next step really, and I understand what the Michigan State Police is saying. Michigan State Police is saying, look, we don't act unless the prosecuting authority tells us to act. So, for instance, if the Michigan Attorney General's office were to reach out to the Michigan State Police and say, look, we have the following concerns about this particular case. We'd like you to investigate it, do an investigation, bring it to us objectively so we can make a charging decision. Procedurally, that's really the way things work. Al and I took this to, when I say the highest level of the Michigan State Police, we couldn't go any higher than that. So it wasn't necessarily a no. It was we identify the myriad of concerns that you all have, because the stuff that we presented, it's not really up for debate, right? I mean, you can look at the things and you've already you've laid them out on your podcast, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's things that happen that simply don't make sense. So,
and there's a paper trail to it. That's the thing.
Absolutely. There's no question about it, right?
Yeah.
This isn't like advocating, or it's not crazy talk. This is stuff that, and people would have to listen to the podcast and go back and hear the things that you've laid out very objectively that nobody can explain. And like the officer that was at the house at 9:30 p.m. notifying the sisters that their mother's car was at the church when the car wasn't even discovered at the church until after 10 p.m. It's things that just on no level make sense. So we still hope that, and we're in the process of taking this to the Michigan Attorney General's office to see if they have their own internal investigations. And, the investigative arm of the Michigan State Police is not the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office. It's not the Wayne County Sheriff's Office. It's not Grosse Pointe Farms. It's the Michigan State Police, and they have internal investigations. So we're not entirely hopeless at this point. We think there's still, some avenues and some pathways to get some attention to this case, because, I've looked at this 10 times over, and look, I've tried cases all over the country. I don't necessarily look at a case and get closed-minded. I'm very open-minded, and I look at the weaknesses and things that maybe don't make sense. But I think very objectively, you can look at things in this particular case, events that occurred, chronologies of what happened, and, hopefully either the Michigan Attorney General's office or the U.S. Attorney's Office and FBI, who I've also been in contact with recently, will still look at this and, request a further investigation to find out what happened and try to answer some of these questions that seem to have no answer to them.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that you worked in organized crime. So I've always said, the family has always said, based on the evidence that we have of everything, they're thinking, obviously, she was murdered because she heard or saw something, right? There has been evidence that Joann visited an FBI office just a few days before she was murdered. Went missing, those type of scenarios. So from an attorney and the organized crime standpoint, do you think there's enough circumstantial evidence towards certain individuals that we've named in the podcast and really shed light on some inconsistencies with just, the drugs within the community and all of those scenarios, the businesses that they own, money laundering, things like that. What's kind of your take on everything we've talked about with that?
I don't think you need to even get that abstract about it. Look, if somebody says, if I come up missing, so-and-so did it, and then you don't investigate so-and-so, i.e. Tim Matouk, or you don't interview him, you don't interrogate him, that in and of itself seems to be a questionable decision. And this isn't, conjecture. This is actually things that the family has noted that was said to them. So this isn't circumstantial evidence. These are things this is direct evidence.
Yeah. And there's
right?
multiple. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. There's also multiple affidavits of individuals, friends, family, siblings that have said Joann was very fearful of Tim. She made that very known to many people without going into detail. I think she was worried about the safety of her kids when it comes down to it, right? She didn't say anything besides, if something happens to me, look to Tim. She was fearful, obviously, of whatever she saw or heard. And, I think it goes to say, and along with that too, I want to touch on, because you kind of just touched on it, it's super important for people to understand is there was never an investigation done.
No, there really never was. I mean, there was no investigation into what seemed to be prime suspects, based on what the direct evidence suggested, based on what the family was told. This isn't, guesswork. These are things that the family has expressed, was told to them by Joann, and then there was no follow-up by the investigative officers. That seems to be very questionable. And, just being involved in, I've charged thousands of crimes in my career as a prosecutor. So, the prosecuting a crime, the anatomy of it, a prosecutor expects certain things to be done from an investigative standpoint that would just be common sense. Mm-hmm. That in this case never happened. And it's not just one thing. There's 30 or 40 things that happened in this case that seem to be out of order. And that's what I think drew my attention to this, my interest in this case, as well as Al Norris. And I'll be very clear again, Al Norris didn't get paid either. Right? Yeah. Al Norris and I spent hundreds of hours, and we are continuing to spend time on this case based on the information that we have, simply because of what we consider to be a travesty of justice. And, this family, imagine how these family members feel. Joann Matouk, Michelle and Kelly and Michael, the family members of this woman, that anyone who knows anything about this case, it is entirely illogical that she would have walked into that water that night and committed suicide. And to even suggest that her body would have traveled and traversed the route that it did to the location where the body was found is improbable. It's impossible virtually, based on the expert investigations, Al's experience and being involved in recovering bodies in the Detroit River, the fact that the water was 2 feet deep with no current. How would it have traveled out 100 yards into a shipping channel and then traveled 30 miles downstream, weeks later to be recovered 30-something miles away? There's just nothing about this case that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. That's the bottom line. So, and that's not an opinion. That's not me advocating anything on behalf of the family. It's just simply based on the evidence of, and doing this as long as I've been doing it and as long as Al's been doing it. There's nothing about this case that makes sense. Yeah,
there really isn't. And
yeah.
I think it's super important. And I've mentioned to the kids, people that listen to the podcast, right? They'll say, what's really like a podcast or a show or a couple people, posting on social media going to do to kind of change the dynamic of a case? And I kind of remind people, like, the more truth and more information we can present to people where they can see the entirety of the facts, right? They can see the evidence for themselves, creates a new narrative, right? So there's been this narrative within the Grosse Pointe Woods, Grosse Pointe Farms communities that She walked into the water to commit suicide. Changing the narrative is important. And, you know, having individuals like you guys that listen to the podcast come forward, were so willing to be helpful. I mean, it was like incredible. It was amazing. Like I said, the first time we hopped on a Zoom call, I was like, holy shit, like they can actually help us. And they're like wanting to help, which is amazing. Right. I think that a lot of that gets lost in cases like this, you know, cold cases, 14 years, we're going to be 15 years next month, that a lot of people don't want to touch it. Right. You get this dynamic of, oh, it's not our problem. It's the next person. It's the next person. So as we're going into 2025, we're going into Joann's 15 year, what can we kind of expect, or what can we share for our listeners to kind of give them an idea of what we're working towards? I know you've kind of mentioned a few things, but how we're going to continue to kind of push Joann's case really to the next level, to push for an investigation.
You know, I think in a case like this, you have to be, you have to understand that we can't give up.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you know, one door may close, but you got to keep searching for justice. Because, and again, the listeners can go back and look at all the things you've presented, but like Al noted, a dry drowning is very, very rare. Right? Joann had no water in her lungs, which is suggestive that she was dumped in that body of water when she was murdered.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, that is not up for debate. That is a fact that we know based on autopsies. We're not going to give up, right? If the Michigan State Police has, again, told us that they need a prosecutorial authority to bring this to them, for them to get involved. And I understand that, because what you're really asking them to do is investigate an entire police agency.
Yeah.
But if you go back and look at the investigation that was done by Grosse Pointe from the beginning, even the police report that states that they saw footprints walking down to the river from the church. There was no snow on the pavement that evening. I've been to that location. I've actually drove out to where she was parked that night. I've looked out to the river's edge during the middle of the day, and you could barely see the river's edge from where she would have been parked at that church location. How would anybody have seen at that hour of the evening when it was pitch black? What would have drawn their attention to the lake's edge that night when there was no footprints in the snow? Because there was no snow. And the police report said they saw footprints in the snow leading to the lake's edge. Things like that are very, very troubling. And again, I'm not saying that any one particular person did anything. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that, having done this as long as I've done this, on both sides of the table, that everything that was done in this case, from the lack of processing the vehicle for prints and DNA, to the police reports having material facts wrong, to the fact that an officer was at the house notifying the family. Who's ever heard of a police agency notifying somebody of a missing person when it was only an hour or two after the church service had concluded?
Right.
That doesn't make sense.
Most missing cases, yeah, most missing cases,
Nobody does that.
You're begging the officers, like, please take my report, and they tell you 48 hours. I mean, yeah.
And look, Al Norris, who's, 30 years, detective sergeant, retired, highest level of Michigan State Police, sent a FOIA request to Grosse Pointe to ask them what their policies and procedures are on reporting a missing person. And they refused to provide that information. And we know why they refused to provide that information, because they procedurally don't go out and notify family members of somebody who's been missing 2 hours from a church service. It was established by the family. It was very common for her to go out after church to dinner, to hang out with friends. It was nothing out of the ordinary for her not to be home 1 or 2 hours after the service. So why was there an officer at the house within 1 or 2 hours after the service had concluded to notify the family that she was missing when the vehicle wasn't even registered to her? They had no reason to even be at the house that night.
Yep. Unless they had
right?
prior knowledge.
Unless they had prior knowledge. And that officer was never identified through depositions, through investigations. Nobody can even identify who was the officer at the house at 9:30 informing the family that Joann was missing when the car wasn't even discovered until 10 p.m., right? So these are the kinds of things that are not like the family being crazy. And I think that's what people want other people to believe, that the family in their, grief essentially has fabricated all this stuff. Look, I have, and again, if this is presented in a chronology, and we have it in a chronology, Al and I presented a chronology to the minute from the hour that the family left the law office at 5 o'clock in the afternoon to the point where the vehicle was discovered at the church and a lien was run on the plate. Virtually nothing that occurred between that 5-hour period of time makes any sense on any level. And, we're not done with this. I'll tell you, if the Michigan State Police has decided they can't internally pursue this without a prosecutorial referral, that's fine, right? We'll take this to the Attorney General. Like I said, I recently had a meeting with the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI to present this to them. Whatever happened that night, I am convinced eventually in time is going to come to light, all right? Because what you've presented in your podcast, and I would strongly urge anybody who's listening to this to go back and listen to the chronology that you presented. Nobody objectively could find this makes any sense on any level.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I really do. When you, and I always tell people to go back and listen multiple times, because we're talking about a lot of things, right? We're talking about a lot of individuals, a lot of evidence, a lot of timestamps, a lot of departments. But I think when you kind of, and I want to touch on this too, when you brought Al Norris in, and Al Norris had said, like, this is messed up. Like, he's looking on the video, he's like, what is, giving me that look, like, what is going on, right? I think it says a lot from somebody who is ex-law enforcement that has this many years under their belt for that to come from an individual outside of, the family and not anybody they hired and not anything like that says a lot. And even with you, with being on, both sides of prosecuting and the years that you've had under your belt, it says a lot when there's individuals who have, some sort of power, are willing to look at the case. So, and I know obviously Joann's kids are so appreciative of you guys and all the work that you guys have put in, and just the willingness to kind of ruffle some feathers because you're noticing, there's an injustice here. So, I think for that, we can kind of leave people with things are still in motion, things are working, and kind of go from there. And hopefully we can update people, in the next few months with some good news. But for now, I think that's pretty much it. Do you think we missed anything or anything else?
No, I think that's a fair, summary of where we are. I don't take no for an answer, right? This is one door that, is somewhat open. We'll take it in other directions. I believe in this case and I believe in this family. And, it's very troubling based on what I know about that community, based on what I know about things that I can't talk about right now in that community involving drug dealing, trafficking. A lot is happening in that community that I think is being not discussed openly. Okay. And I think a lot of it's being, hidden by the different police agencies. But, Al and I don't always agree either, right? Al is a sounding board to me. If I took this to Al and I wanted him to objectively tell me what he thought about it. I have a case right now, a federal lawsuit in the Eastern District with a police brutality case against the Michigan State Police and U.S. Marshals. I took it to Al. I said, hey, you tell me what you think. I'm very, very convinced that this was an improper excessive force by a police agency. He didn't agree with me. He told me, "No, I think you're wrong about that. I reviewed the video of what the police did. I think maybe you're wrong about this." So, he's not a yes man. Al's somebody that I worked with, like I said, for 30 years, and I trust his opinion. And when I presented this to Al, he had the same feelings that I did, that there was on no level any explanation for, like I said, 30 or 40 different things that occurred during the course of the investigation that was very suggestive that Joann Matouk was murdered. Yeah. Right? This was not a suicide. This woman did not traverse down a 5-foot embankment down to the lake in high heels and walk into 2 feet of shallow water and somehow find her way out 100 yards in icy, freezing cold water in January to commit suicide. With a Coast Guard search and rescue that almost happened immediately, with floodlights that couldn't find the body, and then she shows up 30 miles downstream, several weeks later. There's just no way, if any law enforcement would look at this objectively, they would believe that this investigation was done with prudence and the diligence that it should have been conducted, and it was anything other than a cover-up for a murder. Mm-hmm. And I think in time, that's what will be revealed. And nothing in this case has happened quickly. I don't expect that eventually where we end up with this is going to be an easy, quick thing to happen. But I do have hope that eventually, light will be shed on the murder of Joann Matouk. This was not a suicide.
Agreed. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and thank you for taking the time to kind of explain what's been going on and kind of why we have had to be cagey with a lot of our listeners lately. And I hope that in the new year, obviously we can have you back on and just kind of update people, and hopefully we've got good news, right? In this next year coming. But awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liv. Appreciate it.
Okay, we'll chat soon. Okay. Have a good one.
Okay, you as well. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.